The ice broke late that year on the Missouri. When the river finally moved, it did so with the sound of a living thing waking from pain, timbers groaning, floes colliding like gunfire in the distance. The men at Fort Union took it as a sign that trapping season was near its end. By late March, the yard of the great post swarmed with the return of winter brigades. Canoes blackened by pitch, rawhide bundles stacked in the thawing mud, clerks hunched at tables, weighing out pelts by the pound and the prayer. Elias Boone Hardesty stood in that gray morning light, a man who had worn the same beaver-felt hat through 6 winters and never mended it once. His shoulders were as broad as the oaken gates behind him, his beard streaked with frost and pipe ash, his eyes the color of the river in flood, pale, dangerous, unreadable. He was a man of habit. 1 cup of chicory in the morning, 1 twist of tobacco at dusk, 1 word where 3 would do. The others said he'd been a preacher once, and back east, though no one could recall him quoting scripture. In the trading yard, the air was a stew of odors, smoked hides, musk of pelts, the iron tang of blood still frozen in fur. Métis children chased dogs between stacks of buffalo robes. A Frenchman's fiddle drifted out from the mess hall, thin as wind through chinks. Charles Larpenteur, clerk of the American Fur Company, was balancing the season's books when Hardesty entered. "You're late, Boone," he said, not looking up. "Your brigade's packs come in heavy, though." Mr. Chouteau will smile on that. Hardesty set a small object on the table, a folded scrap of parchment bound with raw sinew. "This here," he said quietly, "ain't fur. It's a road." Larpenteur raised his eyes, squinting. The parchment was old, brittle, stained with smoke and sweat. Lines of faded ink crawled across it in odd curves, and sigils, a crude map drawn by an uncertain hand. Symbols dotted the lower margin, a sun, a serpent, and something that might have been a church. "What road?" Larpenteur asked. "The one south of Taos. The Spaniards worked silver there once, long before the mountain men ever came west. The man who drew this died last night in the fort infirmary. Name was Santiago Alvarado, muleteer out of Taos. Claimed he saw the mines as a boy." Larpenteur's mouth twisted into a doubtful smile. "A Spaniard's tale," he said. "We've got more of those than we've got beaver." Hardesty didn't argue. He simply took back the parchment, folding it as carefully as a priest handling relics. That night, as snow hissed into the river, he sat by the fireside outside the fort palisade, the map spread across his knees. The ink lines shimmered in lamplight, their curves tracing rivers and mountains that half matched his memory, half invented new ones. The dying muleteer's voice still echoed in his head, rasping, fevered, clutching at Hardesty's sleeve. "Señor Boone, el mapa es verdad. The mines. They shine in the rock like moonlight. I was a boy. My father, he worked there. We fled when the Comanche came. Hardesty had found the man 2 days earlier, collapsed near the gate with his pack torn open, his mule gone lame. He'd carried him to the infirmary himself, fed him broth when the others wouldn't. The man had recognized him somehow, remembering a long-ago raid on the Yellowstone, when Hardesty, still a green trapper, had dragged 2 wounded Mexicans from a burning lodge. "You saved me once," the muleteer whispered. "Now I give you this." He'd pressed the parchment into Hardesty's hand before slipping into fever and silence. By the 3rd evening, talk of the Spanish map had spread through the fort like sparks through dry grass. Trappers gathered around the fire pit, grinning through the smoke. Joe Meek spat into the flames. "Silver mines, is it? Next he'll be sayin' there's French vineyards up the Big Horn." A young Jim. Bridger laughed, the sound sharp as a snapping twig. "Ain't no Spaniard ever left treasure they didn't take back with 'em. That map's a drunk friar's doodle, I'll wager." Even Larpenteur joined in the teasing, his voice carrying from the doorway. "Boone, if you're fixin' to chase ghosts, tell me first, I'll mark your grave on the company ledger proper." Hardesty listened without reply. When the laughter died, he said only, "A man ought to see with his own eyes before he calls a thing false." He turned in early that night, rolling his blanket tight. But sleep would not come. The wind off the river moaned like distant speech. Somewhere beyond those walls lay the bones of old empires, the paths Coronado's riders had carved through dust and legend. If even half the map was true, there might be passes unmarked, waters unnamed, things worth more than silver to a man who measured wealth in discovery. At dawn, fog lay over the Missouri like smoke from a giant's pipe. Hardesty rose, packed his possibles, and went to the company yard. The clerk was still counting pelts when he stopped him. "You'll mark me absent from next season's roll," Hardesty said. Larpenteur frowned. "You're bound south, then?" Hardesty nodded. "Ain't for fur this time. A debt owed." "Debt?" He didn't elaborate. But those who watched him saddle his horse saw the way he tied the map's case to his belt, as if afraid the wind might steal it. Outside the walls, the plains glimmered under melting frost. Crows picked at carcasses left by the thaw. The river spoke softly behind him, carrying fragments of ice and rumor down to Street Louis, where such tales were sold for whiskey and forgotten by spring. Elias Boone Hardesty turned his horse toward the horizon, the line of cottonwoods marking the far edge of the known. He paused once to look back. Fort Union squatted against the gray skylogs, smoke, and the faint echo of laughter from men who would never know the pull of an unproven map. He touched the worn brim of his hat, as though saluting the memory of the muleteer. "All right, old friend," he murmured. "Let's see if your ghosts can still speak." The horse stepped forward, hooves sinking into the thawing earth. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sage and distance. Somewhere ahead, the old Spanish trails waited faint scars on the land, leading toward sunburnt mesas and the shimmer of a story no one believed. Behind him, Fort Union's gates closed with a heavy thud, sealing in the comfort of certainty. Ahead lay the thin thread of a man's faith drawn in iron gall ink across the unknown. Elias Boone Hardesty rode south. Snow still streaked the shadows when Elias Boone Hardesty left the Missouri for the uplands. The country rose in long gray waves, each ridge higher and emptier than the last. He rode with a small outfit bound for the Green River rendezvous, 6 men, a dozen mules, and 2 freight horses pulling a sledge of powder and traps. They followed the thaw north and west, hugging creek bottoms where cottonwoods had yet to leaf, camping where the night froze their coffee before dawn. The trail from Fort Union to Wind River was no road at all, only the memory of one. Old wheel ruts, faint as scars, crossed the prairie where Manuel Lisa's traders once passed. Wind cut through elk hide and bone alike. Yet Hardesty moved as if the land itself whispered its turns. He marked the sun by the blade of his knife, tested every crossing with a stick, and slept light as a fox. It was at the Powder River ford that they took on a new man, Joseph McKinnon, a Scots clerk fresh from Street Louis, thin as a fence rail, spectacles forever slipping down his nose. He carried no rifle, only a satchel of notebooks and a brass compass polished like a mirror. "You'll need more than ink where we're going," one trapper muttered. McKinnon smiled faintly. "Ink can find things. Powder never will." That night by the fire, when the wind died and the coyotes started, Hardesty unfolded the Spanish map. McKinnon bent over it, tracing the fading lines with a gloved finger. "These symbols see here? That's not mere ornament. It's castellated script, old missionary work. The friars of New Mexico marked distances in rosaries, not leagues. Every bead meant a day's ride." Hardesty frowned. "Then this line? Mountains. Perhaps the Sierra Madre, or your Wind River Range if the map's mirrored." Hardesty chewed a twig. "So the Spaniards might have drawn it backward?" "They often did when copying from memory." McKinnon's eyes glinted in the firelight. "Your friend in Taos may have known more than he guessed." By May, the snowfields thinned to slush. They passed the 3 forks and entered the Wind River Valley, where the earth steamed and bison grazed, knee-deep in meltwater. The men grew restless. Every hoofbeat through mud was a reminder of the distance yet ahead. Hardesty hunted daily to keep spirits up antelope, a stray elk cow, once a grizzly that charged the camp at dusk. When he skinned it, he found the bullet of another hunter lodged near the spine, green with age. He pocketed it without comment. One evening, as they camped under the red cliffs of Owl Creek, McKinnon joined him by the fire. "You ever think," he asked quietly, "why men chase ghosts across these mountains?" Hardesty shrugged. "Some chase fur, some chase glory, I chase debts." "Debts?" A muleteer from Taos saved my hide once. Arrow through the leg, pulled me out when the Blackfeet were closing. Died for it, near enough. I owe him the truth of his map." McKinnon nodded slowly. "A fairer reason than most." They sat in silence, listening to the river gnawing at its banks. Above them, the stars burned hard and cold, the same ones Coronado's riders had followed 3 centuries before. By June, they reached the southern slopes where the Sweetwater twisted through sage and red stone. Here the real test began. The weather turned cruelly fickle, sun at noon, sleet by dusk. Horses stumbled on shale ridges slick with melt. On the 6th day a storm burst from the west, swallowing the sky in black cloud. The men struggled toward a cleft they hoped would lead them through. It was Devil's Gate, a narrow canyon cut by the river like a knife wound through granite. Rain became ice. The water below roared with snowmelt, rising by the hour. The sledge broke an axle. One mule slipped and vanished into the torrent. Panic spread. McKinnon shouted over the din, "We'll have to turn back." "No!" Hardesty barked. "We cross, or we're buried in flood." He stripped a coil of hemp rope from his pack, his own making, double-twisted and waxed with pine tar. While the others huddled under slickers, he climbed the cliff face, driving an iron piton into a fissure. When he reached a shelf halfway across, he looped the rope around a leaning aspen, then shouted for the men to lash gear and slide it over hand by hand. It was slow, brutal work. Twice the line sagged, twice Hardesty tightened it with a makeshift pulley of sticks and sweat. McKinnon was the last to cross, trembling, clutching his satchel of notes. When they finally stumbled onto solid ground, soaked and shivering, the Scotsman looked back at the swaying line. "You just saved our hides, Boone." Hardesty only nodded, wringing water from his coat. "A rope's worth more than a prayer when the river's hungry." The storm passed by dawn. They rose to find the air clean and brittle, the ground jeweled with frost. Hardesty climbed a nearby ridge to scout ahead. From there he saw what the map had promised, a lone red spire jutting from the plain like a spear point, sunlight striking its tip. He pulled the parchment from his belt. The drawing on its edge, a needle-shaped mark beside a looped river, matched perfectly. He called down to McKinnon, "We've got her the red needle!" The men gathered below, staring. Some spat tobacco, unimpressed. Others crossed themselves. McKinnon's voice trembled. "Then it's true." Hardesty folded the map with care. "It's startin' to be." They camped that night in the lee of the spire, wind humming through fissures like a church organ. Hardesty could not sleep. He sat watching the stars slide over the horizon, the map spread once more on his knee. He thought of the dying muleteer's hand clutching his own, of the laughter in Fort Union, of all the roads men took for things unseen. Around him, the mountains whispered like surf on some forgotten shore. He whispered back, half to himself, half to the ghosts of Spaniards and trappers and dreamers gone before. "Tomorrow we follow the line." The fire burned low. Far off, a wolf howled, and the sound rolled through the canyon like the echo of faith. Elias Boone Hardesty closed his eyes, and the rope that had saved them swung gently in the night wind, a thin lifeline between the world of the known and the vast silence beyond. Morning broke sharp and silver, the kind of mountain dawn that bites first and warms only if it chooses. Elias Boone Hardesty rose before the others, brushing frost from his blanket. The air was thin, the light clearer than glass, and every rock, every tuft of sage, cast a shadow as dark as gunpowder. Below, the Sweetwater ran thick and brown from the storm, an angry vein cutting through stone. The men stirred one by one, moving slow from stiffness and hunger. Coffee boiled bitter on the fire. Someone coughed blood from a cracked lip. All that remained of their dried meat could have fit into a man's hat. Still, they spoke little of turning back. To men like these, retreat was an uglier word than death. McKinnon emerged from his blankets, spectacles fogged, hair matted by frost. "We'll have to find a crossing before noon," he said, voice raw. "Another storm, and we'll lose the animals." Hardesty nodded. He studied the water. The Sweetwater wasn't wide, but it was mean swollen by melt, snarling through Devil's Gate with the fury of a beast cornered. A wrong step would drag horse and man into a grinder of stone and ice. They tried the shallows first, cutting willows for poles and sounding the current. 2 mules went under before noon. The men cursed the day they'd ever followed a map drawn in ink older than their grandfathers. By afternoon the storm clouds had retreated behind the peaks, leaving the air white and still. That was when Hardesty's idea returned to him, born out of memory and stubbornness. He walked to the ridge where the rope bridge from the last storm still hung in his mind. "We'll build her again," he said, "but this time we use the canyon walls." The others stared. The gap at Devil's Gate was near 50 feet across, a roar of river between sheer granite. Bridger laughed first. "Boone, you've gone tetched. Ain't no man crawling that wall." Hardesty ignored him. "I've got pitch, rope, and a pair of hands that ain't forgot how to tie a Spanish bowline. You can wait here and rot, or help." Something in his voice silenced them. They set to work. They stripped the mules of pack cords, cut their remaining rope into lengths, and braided them tight with willow bark and sinew until the line felt alive beneath their palms. By dusk, Hardesty was halfway up the eastern wall, driving a piton with his hatchet. The wind came up fierce, whistling through the gap. Below, the men watched like parishioners at a mad sermon. When he reached the midpoint, he tied a doubled loop, slung the main rope through, and swung himself across the gap. The world tilted the roar of the river below, the burn in his arms, the ache of rope-biting skin, but he made the other side. Cheers echoed faint and hollow against the rock. They anchored the line, stretched it taut, and ferried gear hand over hand. McKinnon went last, clutching his satchel to his chest as though it were scripture. When he collapsed on the far side, his hands were bloodied raw. He looked up at Hardesty, panting. "You saved us again." "Saved the map, more like," Elias muttered, coiling the rope with care. They camped beyond the gorge, building a small fire under an overhang where smoke could not betray them. The night smelled of wet rock and horse sweat. Somewhere out in the dark, wolves barked once and fell silent. McKinnon cleaned his hands, then unfolded the map once more. "You see, Boone," he said softly, "there's a line here faint, almost erased, from the red needle to the symbol of the cross. That's a miner's mark, I think. It means they found silver there, or died trying." Hardesty leaned closer. "Then tomorrow we ride for it." "Tomorrow," the Scotsman said, "we may ride into nothing at all." Boone looked into the fire, nothing still worth seeing. They reached the plateau the next day, a high country of sage and silence, broken by black volcanic ridges. The map led them true, or near enough. The ground bore signs of human passage long vanished. Squared stones half buried, a length of rusted chain, the faint trench of an old ditch line. "Spanish work," McKinnon whispered. "See how the rocks cut, not split by frost. They dug here." They followed the trench until it ended in a shallow basin where the mountain bled red through the gray iron oxide staining the soil. There they found it, the mouth of a collapsed shaft, timbers petrified by centuries, a pickaxe rusted to the handle. Beside it, a silver crucifix, blackened with age. Hardesty knelt, brushing dirt away. "Bones," he murmured. Beneath the dust lay fragments, shattered skulls, a rosary tangled in ribs. The wind rose, hissing through the shaft mouth like a whisper of prayer or curse. McKinnon crossed himself. "So the legend was true. True enough to bury men," said Hardesty, "but I don't see no treasure." He picked up the crucifix, weighing it in his palm. It was heavy still, cold as the heart of the hill. That evening they made camp on a ridge above the diggings. Below them the land fell away into waves of ochre and gray, rolling toward the far desert like the folds of a sleeping giant. The setting sun bled through thin cloud, painting everything in fire. McKinnon sat beside him, scribbling in his journal. "I'll tell you something, Boone. Even if there's no silver, this place, these marks, these bones, they're history. Proof that the Spaniards reached farther north than any scholar claims. You'll be written into that story." Hardesty smiled faintly. "Ain't looking to be written anywhere. Just want to pay a debt." He turned the crucifix over again, watching the last light fade from its edge. "They died chasin' what they couldn't carry home. Maybe that's all any of us do." The Scotsman looked up from his notes. "And yet we chase it still. Because if you stop," Boone said, "you start dying where you stand." The fire cracked between them, throwing sparks that vanished into the dark. Beyond, the hills waited ancient, patient, silent witnesses to men who came, dug, dreamed, and were forgotten. Elias Boone Hardesty lay back against his saddle, eyes tracing constellations older than the oldest map. The stars shone hard as flint, and the wind that came down from the Red Needle carried the faint scent of silver, real or imagined, it did not matter. The map had not lied, though its promise had changed. The treasure was the road itself. And come morning, that road would lead him farther still, into lands no Spaniard's hand had drawn, and where no man yet had set a name. For 3 days the wind never stopped. It came down from the west like a sea breaking, carrying the scent of stone and old fire. Elias Boone Hardesty led the pack animals in slow circles around the basin, marking the ridges and sketching crude bearings in the dirt with a stick. The land was dead quiet, no birds, no insects, no movement except the wind tugging through the grass. The Spanish diggings sprawled across the slope like the ribs of a giant buried in shale. Rusted iron lay half swallowed by clay, picks, chisels, the twisted hoops of ore baskets. A few timbers still stood, gray as bone, framing the black mouth of the collapsed shaft. Hardesty and Joseph McKinnon spent their mornings clearing debris, testing for any sign of metal. They found shards of quartz veined faintly with silver, but nothing that could be called a lode. What they did find was stranger a line of stacked stones leading uphill, each engraved with a crude cross. "Graves," McKinnon murmured, kneeling beside the first. The earth around it was hard-packed, as if sealed by centuries of heat. Or warnings. Hardesty nodded. "Could be. Both." He drew his knife and tapped the rock. The hollow sound answered back like a drum beat. Beneath, something shifted bone, brittle and white. He replaced the stone carefully. Best leave 'em to their sleep. They camped higher that night, above the diggings where a spring trickled from the rock, the water tasted of iron. In the firelight, McKinnon read aloud from his journal, copying fragments of the map and noting each relic they'd uncovered. "This place changes the story," he said quietly. "All the scholars back east, they argue Coronado never reached this far. But look at this crucifix. These tools proof that Spain's shadow fell across the Rockies after all." Hardesty poked at the coals with a stick. "Spain's shadow don't mean much to the men it buried." The Scotsman smiled faintly. "You think it cursed?" "I think some ground remembers pain." On the 4th morning they woke to hoofprints circling the camp, fresh, narrow, unshod. By 9 noon, 3 Ute warriors appeared on the ridge, wrapped in bison robes despite the heat. Their ponies watched with the same wary stillness as their riders. McKinnon reached for his musket, but Hardesty raised a hand. "Hold." He stepped forward slowly, palms open. "How?" he called in the trade tongue. "We mean no harm." The eldest of the 3 dismounted. His hair was bound with crow feathers, his eyes sharp as river ice. He looked at the crucifix hanging from Boone's neck, then at the black scar of the mine. "This ground," he said in broken English, "belongs to the sun's anger." Hardesty nodded. "We only look, we dig no more." The man gestured toward the hill. "Spaniards came long ago. They took silver from the sun's bones. The hills burned, men sickened, the river ran black. We call it Tawa to Ko, the place where the light dies." McKinnon translated in a whisper, awed. "He's saying the ore itself poisoned them. The mine killed its keepers." The Ute looked between them, his voice quiet. "You dig, you die." Then he turned his pony and rode off, the others following without sound, disappearing into the pale grass as if the land had swallowed them whole. For a long time neither man spoke. The wind moaned through the empty shafts like breath through a flute. Finally Hardesty said, "Reckon the old man told us what the map wouldn't." McKinnon closed his journal. "So the treasure's cursed?" Boone shook his head. "No, just claimed." That night the mountains burned with sunset copper, crimson, gold, fading into shadow. Hardesty sat apart, whittling at a piece of cedar. The crucifix lay beside him, gleaming faintly in the firelight. McKinnon joined him. "So what now?" "We mark the place," Boone said, "and ride out before the ghosts decide we've overstayed." McKinnon nodded, but his eyes stayed on the shaft mouth below. You realize, Boone, this discovery, if I take it to Street Lewis, it'll rewrite the maps. You'll be a legend." Hardesty smiled wearily. "Legends don't last. Men like us leave tracks till the next wind covers 'em." He rose, stretched, and looked toward the east, where the Sweetwater shimmered faintly in moonlight. The Spaniards came huntin' silver and left bones. "We came huntin' truth and found theirs? That's payment enough." He poured the last of their coffee on the fire, quenching the coals. Steam hissed upward like a sigh. At dawn they carved a small cross into a rock above the mine and packed their gear. As the sun crested the ridge, the light caught the crucifix still hanging from Boone's saddle horn, flashing once like a signal from another age. They rode south without a word, the wind at their backs, the ghosts of the Spaniards whispering through the grass. Behind them, the basin returned to silence, the soundless resting place of faith, folly, and men who had mistaken one for the other. The map folded carefully in. Hardesty's coat felt lighter now, as if a debt had been paid, though neither could yet say to whom. The next year brought thunder along the plains, the kind that carried wheels instead of hooves. By the spring of 1835, the trade in pelts had thinned like the hair on an old bull's hide, and the talk among trappers turned from beaver to settlers. Whole families were crossing the Missouri now, their wagons straining west toward Oregon and the promise beyond. Fort Union filled with new faces. Farmers in canvas coats, women with sunburned cheeks, preachers clutching Bibles that smelled of river mud. Elias Boone Hardesty came down from the mountains that spring, leaner, quieter, with the Spanish map folded small in his breast pocket. He had seen what gold and silver did to men and how quick the earth swallowed both. Now he meant to earn his keep, guiding others safely across it. He found work easy. His reputation, half myth already, preceded him, the man who crossed Devil's Gate on a rope, who found the bones of Spaniards and came back sane. The American Fur Company recommended him to a party of emigrants gathering near Independence. 11 wagons, 24 souls, a preacher, a blacksmith, and a family from Illinois with 3 children and a mule named Glory. They called him Captain Boone, though he never asked for the title. His second was Joseph McKinnon, who had returned from Street. Louis, with fresh notebooks, spectacles mended with wire, and a zeal for charting the new road to Oregon. Together, they led the wagons west, following ruts that were still more dream than path. By June they reached the Platte. The prairie rolled flat and endless under a vault of blue that made men feel smaller than prayer. Grasshoppers rose in clouds, horses sweated, and the women sang to keep the children calm. Every evening Hardesty walked the line, checking axles, feeling wheel hubs for heat. He moved like a man, listening to the ground. One night by the fire, a young man from Kentucky asked, "Boone, you ever see the ocean?" "Only in dreams," Hardesty said, "and in those it's always behind me." McKinnon laughed softly. "He means he's bound for whatever's past it." The next day the Platte turned muddy, choked with driftwood. They lost 2 oxen in the current and nearly a child. The wind blew dust like gun smoke. Still, they pressed on. By midsummer, the wagon train approached the Sweetwater country, the same land where Hardesty had once fought flood and found the Red Needle. The heat there could boil a man's reason. Storms built out of nowhere, dark as smelter smoke, then vanished like sin forgiven. It was near Devil's Gate again that trouble found them. A thunderhead rolled from the west, fat and black, cracking lightning against the peaks. Hardesty ordered the wagons into a line along the canyon wall. "Double-check your hitches," he barked. "Storm water'll come quick." The first rain hit like a shot. In minutes, the dry wash below turned to a screaming river, brown and rising. The lead wagon, a heavy one loaded with tools, lurched as the ground under its right wheel gave way. A woman screamed, oxen bellowed and snapped their yoke pins. The wagon tipped, slid, and hung half over the torrent, teetering. Hardesty was there in 3 strides. "Axes!" he shouted. "Cut those animals loose!" McKinnon waded in with him, water up to his waist, notebook forgotten. "Boone, look at the wheel, it's slipping." Hardesty's eyes snapped upward to the cliff face. In that instant, memory struck the rope bridge at Devil's Gate, the pull of hemp under strain, the sound of water waiting to eat men alive. "Ropes!" he bellowed. "Bring me every line you've got, bed cords, trace leather, whatever'll hold." They lashed 3 together, tied one end around a juniper root, the other to the wagon's rear axle. The current jerked, almost tearing it free. The family clung to the wagon bed, father, mother, 2 children crying in the rain. Hardesty tied the last length around his chest and slid down the bank. McKinnon grabbed his arm. "You can't hold against that current." "Don't have to," Boone said. "Just need to buy him time." He dropped into the water, boots vanishing, rope jerking taut. The shock stole his breath. With the river clawing at his legs, he fought hand over hand to the wagon, wedged his shoulder beneath the wheel, and shouted to the men above, "Pull steady!" Mud gave way under his boots, then firmed as the line tightened. The wagon rocked once, twice, and came level. Hands reached down from the bank, dragging the family out one by one. When the last child reached safety, Hardesty cut the rope at his chest and let the current carry him a dozen yards before crawling onto shore. The train erupted in cheers, but he only sat there, coughing river water and blood. McKinnon knelt beside him. "Boone, that trick of yours just saved half the train." Hardesty spat, grinned faintly. "Ain't a trick. Just rope, faith, and too much stubborn to drown." When the storm passed, the valley lay quiet again, grass flattened, stars returning above. The wagons creaked as they settled in the mud. Fires were lit, coffee boiled. The children brought Hardesty a blanket and a cup. He looked out toward Devil's Gate, where moonlight shimmered on the floodwater. The same river that had tried to kill him twice had now spared others. Maybe that was the real silver in these hills, the kind a man couldn't spend, only pass along. McKinnon came over, writing as he walked. "I'll record today in the log," he said. "They'll want to remember it." Hardesty shook his head. "Don't write my name, write theirs. The ones who held that rope when it counted." The Scotsman smiled. "You've a strange sense of glory, Boone." "Maybe, but the mountain don't remember names, only the sound of men trying to stay alive." The night closed around them, full of steam and silence. In the distance, thunder rolled again, gentle this time, like a drumbeat fading toward the west. Elias Boone Hardesty lay back beside the fire, hat over his eyes, and thought of the muleteer, of silver veins and bones in the earth, and of the rope that tied one generation's folly to another's salvation. He slept before he finished the thought, the river whispering beside him like a voice from an old map, promising that every debt given time finds its way home. The first snow came early, soft as ash and twice as cold. The wagon train had long since gone their separate ways, some south toward Santa Fe, others west for Oregon, and by December, Elias Boone Hardesty and Joseph McKinnon were the only men left riding through the high country. Their horses' breath steamed in the frozen air, and every sound seemed swallowed by the whiteness. They reached Fort Bridger just as the river iced over. The post was little more than a log stockade and a cluster of cabins huddled against the wind. Jim Bridger himself, still wiry and restless, with a laugh like a rifle crack, welcomed them inside with whiskey and stories. "So you're the one they call Rope Boone," Bridger grinned. "Saved a train down the Sweet Water, they say. Ain't many come back from that kind of flood." Hardesty just smiled beneath his beard. "Didn't come back alone," Bridger laughed, clapped him on the shoulder, and poured another round. "Well, you'll find no floods here. Just cold, boredom, and enough snow to bury the Almighty himself." They took quarters in an empty cabin. For days the wind howled like wolves across the plateau, rattling shutters and shaking the chimney stones. McKinnon spent his hours transcribing notes, his journal swelling thick with ink and wonder. Hardesty mended gear, sharpened blades, smoked quietly by the hearth, and thought of the muleteer's dying eyes. It was during that long gray stretch that a stranger arrived, a Franciscan friar, traveling alone, his robe crusted with frost, his mule limping. He introduced himself as Fray Esteban de Ortega, bound north from Santa Fe with letters for the Jesuit missions. Bridger, suspicious of all priests, muttered something about holy fools in the wrong mountains, but Hardesty offered the friar shelter in their cabin. That evening, as the wind moaned outside, Fray Esteban warmed his hands by the fire and noticed the folded parchment Boone kept near his rifle. "That's no trader's account," he said softly. "May I see it?" Hardesty hesitated, then passed it over. The friar unfolded the brittle sheet with careful fingers. When he saw the symbols, sun, serpent, crucifix, his face changed. "Dios mío," he whispered. "I know this hand." McKinnon leaned forward. "You recognize the script?" The friar nodded. "I do. It was drawn by Fray Antonio de Escalante, one of the last plines, survivors of the Coronado remnants. I studied his journals as a novice. He mapped not gold, but souls, the villages of the pueblo and the lost missions buried by time. This, he traced a faint line across the parchment, was his final route before he vanished." Hardesty stared into the flames. Then the muleteer's tale was true. "Partly," said Esteban. "Escalante sought a silver valley. Yes, but not for treasure. He believed the mines themselves were cursed. His last letter said, 'The earth has swallowed the sun's bones, and those who dig them awake its wrath.' He sealed this map with the mark of warning, not promise." McKinnon exhaled slowly, his mind turning over the revelation. So all along, the map was a warning to stay away. The friar nodded. "And yet you followed it." Boone smiled faintly. "A man can't tell if a light's holy or hellfire till he gets close enough to burn." For several nights, the friar remained at Fort Bridger, sharing tales of the early missionaries who had crossed deserts barefoot, carrying only crosses and faith. Hardesty listened quietly. He was no churchman, but he respected anyone who faced wilderness with nothing but belief. One night, as the wind dropped and the fire crackled low, Esteban asked, "What did you find at the end of the trail, senor?" "Bones," Boone said. And silence. "Then perhaps you found truth enough," the friar replied. "God hides his lessons in the ground, same as silver. Both will cut your hands if you dig too deep." The next morning, Fray Esteban left with the dawn, blessing them both and leaving behind a small copper medallion, a sunburst stamped with a cross. McKinnon turned it over in his hand. "You'll keep it?" Hardesty slipped it into his pocket. "A reminder not to go digging where the earth says no." By February, the snow began to break. The river groaned under its crust, and the smell of thaw came like breath through the trees. One afternoon, a messenger rode in from the Platte with a pouch of letters from the Missouri. Among them was one addressed to Mr. Joseph McKinnon, gentleman and cartographer. He read it twice, then looked up. "The company wants me back in St. Louis. They're publishing my journals. Says they'll make a book of the expedition, The Road of the Spaniards." Hardesty grinned. "You'll be famous then." McKinnon shrugged. "I'd rather be truthful. I'll tell them the map was real, but the treasure was a lie." Boone looked out at the horizon, where the snow still clung to the ridges like ghosts. "Not a lie," he said. "Just not what folks think treasure ought to be." When spring came, they packed their gear and parted ways, McKinnon east for the cities and ink, Boone south for the wild. They shook hands by the gate of the fort, wind tugging at their coats. "You ever come to St. Louis," the Scotsman said, "there'll be a place for you. Folks ought to hear your story from your own mouth." Boone smiled. "Ain't much of a story without the land beneath it. You tell it your way, Joe. Just don't leave out the muleteer." Then he turned his horse toward the empty hills. Snowmelt ran in thin silver threads across the earth, the only silver worth chasing. Behind him, Fort Bridger shrank to a dark smudge against the white plain. Ahead lay the unmarked horizon, and somewhere beyond it, the next road, the next promise, the next map no one would believe. The trunk was old before anyone thought to open it. Its hinges, blackened by decades of dust, gave way with a sigh that seemed older still. Inside lay a map, folded and refolded, until the creases were soft as cloth, and beside it a coil of rope frayed, tar-black, smelling faintly of pine and river water. The tag on the trunk read, in fading script, E. B. Hardesty. The year was 1850, and the world that had once belonged to trappers and wanderers had been carved into lines and deeds. Fort Laramie no longer echoed with the laughter of French voyageurs or the barking of trade dogs, but with the creak of wagon wheels and the hammering of army carpenters. The frontier had moved west. Civilization followed close behind. Lieutenant James Larkin, fresh from West Point, had been tasked with sorting through the fort's old stores. "Mark what's junk and what's worth keeping," his captain had said. To Larkin, most of it looked like the bones of a forgotten world, broken muskets, moldy journals, arrow-pierced powder horns. Yet the map in the trunk caught his eye. He carried it to the light. The paper was brittle but legible, Spanish ink, old hand. In the corner, beneath a faded sun symbol, someone had written in small, careful letters, "Copied from the possession of Santiago Alvarado, Taos, 1834 EB. Hardesty." Larkin smoothed the page on the table. The lines showed a sweep of country between the Platte and the desert south of the Green River. He recognized the Sweetwater by its looping bends, and there a mark shaped like a needle. Next to it, in Hardesty's cramped script, the red spire proof. He turned to Sergeant Miller, the post engineer, who stood watching with a mug of coffee. "Ever hear of a Hardesty?" Miller nodded slowly. "Old mountain man, rode with Bridger's crowd. Word was, he found a Spanish mine and walked away from it. Died somewhere near the Platte 20 years back." Larkin traced the map's edge with a gloved finger. "Funny thing is, the rope in this trunk, it's knotted in what looks like a suspension rig, same kind I learned in engineering school." Miller chuckled. "Wouldn't surprise me. The Corps borrowed half its tricks from fellows who never saw a uniform." Over the next weeks, Larkin studied the map between patrols. He sketched copies, measured the coordinates by guess and habit, and read through the accompanying pages, a small notebook, its ink browned to sepia. In Hardesty's hand were fragments of memory, weather reports, bearings, sketches of ridges, the names of men long gone. But here and there, the tone changed, growing more personal. "McKinnon's gone east, says they'll print our tale. Let them. Truth's the only coin won't rust." The friar was right. "The map's a warning, not a promise. If any man finds this, tell him the rope held." Larkin closed the book and stared into the fire. He thought of the great wagon trains rolling past the fort each day, the women clutching children, the men shouting curses at the ruts. They crossed rivers now with army bridges tight, ordered, reliable. None knew the name of the man who first tied hemp between canyon walls so others might pass. He took the rope from the trunk that night. The hemp fibers cracked as he uncoiled them. Then, with a length of new line from the fort store, he copied the old pattern, the double twist, the anchor loop, the Spanish bowline. It was clever, strong, efficient. He added the design to his sketchbook and labeled it Hardesty Method Field Bridge Rigging. By spring, the technique appeared in the Corps' manual under a new name, Expeditionary Suspension Line, Type A. No one at the fort thought to ask who had invented it. That summer, a survey team heading west stopped at Fort Laramie for supplies. Among them was a wiry Scotsman with steel-rimmed spectacles and white in his beard, Professor Joseph McKinnon, now a lecturer from St. Louis, traveling to retrace the early trade routes. When Larkin mentioned the trunk, McKinnon's eyes widened. He asked to see it in private. The young officer watched as the old man unfolded the map with trembling hands. "I drew half of these notes," McKinnon murmured. "He, Boone Hardesty, drew the rest. We thought it lost forever." Larkin poured him coffee. "You knew him then?" "Knew him?" McKinnon smiled sadly. "He saved my life more times than the Almighty. But he wouldn't want a monument. Only that his rope held when it mattered." He looked down at the paper, tracing the faded sun symbol with one fingertip. He believed the land could teach a man everything if he listened more than he spoke. Perhaps that's why the earth kept his secret this long. When McKinnon left the next morning, he carried the map and notebook with him, promising to donate them to the Museum of the Mountain Man in St. Louis. Larkin didn't protest. He had copied every line. Years later, when the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal published an article titled "The Lost Cartography of E.B." Hardesty, the editors called it, a bridge between eras, the ink of the Spanish friars joined to the ropework of the American frontier. Scholars argued whether Hardesty had truly found Coronado's lost mines or only the ghost of them. It didn't matter. Out on the plains, where rivers still swelled and snapped their banks every spring, soldiers and settlers alike crossed on rope lines, patterned after one man's hands. His name was seldom spoken, but his work held firm. And somewhere far beyond the Platte, under a red spire where the wind still sang through the stones, a crucifix lay buried in the dust, its chain rusted through, its gleam faded. But when the sun struck it just right, it still caught a spark, as if remembering the man who had carried it, the muleteer who had died for it, and the map that no one believed until it led them all home. "Some men find gold," Mackinnon would later write, "and some men find the paths others will walk to find it." The rope held, the ink endured, and the trail of Elias Boone Hardesty lived on not in silver, but in the steady hands of those who crossed where he once stood.